I have here a 2003 2GTL Type S rear spindle. The 3GTL is going to be very similar. I, however, am not sure if the 3GTL Type S will have any interference issues. Now, what you will do with your cutting is to cut around the perimeter of the parking brake as seen here. It should allow you for just enough room for you to slip on your rotor. That's because if you put it on as it is now, then the rear face of the rotor will hit the backing plate. So if you grab your electric circular saw or grinder with a cutoff wheel, you will, as mentioned, just cut around the parking brake, just as you see here. So just be mindful of your piston for the parking brake, which lies up top here, and below to be mindful of your parking brake. You do not want to cut too far into this. So let's put on your safety equipment and let's start cutting. Now, if you have good parking brakes, just be careful of your cuts. You don't want to be cutting too deep as you might damage the braking shoes. But if you're changing your parking brake, which I highly recommend, then screw it. Just throw caution to the wind. Now, what I recommend is to cut the backing plate in sections. That way you can comfortably and carefully cut where you want to cut. Now as you're cutting, you may want to take a peek on the back side to make sure you're not cutting too deep into anything that you shouldn't be cutting into. And remember, the parts that you are cutting can be hot and sharp, so be careful there. Now forgive me, as you see here, my blade was running low and I forgot my replacement blades at the shop. Next, with your hammer, give it a few love taps where you have just cut to break off the piece or to give it a little bit more room for you to cut as you bend it back. Now, as you remove the pieces, again, just be careful that it is hot and sharp. And as you can see, by cutting around the perimeter of the parking brake, it lets you create a nice sort of round shape. Now continue doing that for the rest of the backing plate. Do keep in mind that you'll probably have slightly more difficulty cutting since I have the spindle off of the car. It's doable on car, of course, but you'll just have a little less freedom in your movement as you go along. Now what you'll see me doing here, as mentioned, was to cut it in sections. This makes things a little bit easier for me to work with. And as you see here, I accidentally hammered the backing plate a little bit too much into the arm, so I'm just going to go around from the back side and give it a few taps here, just like that. Ooh, it's a little hot. And there we are. Take a quick peek at how you're cutting so far, and it seems okay. And we'll just continue, once again, following the perimeter of that parking brake. At the bottom here, we have the parking cable. Just be a little bit careful and don't go too far into it as you cut. You want to cut just enough to remove the backing plate. And unfortunately, my blade was getting a little too short, so it was getting a little bit difficult to reach the backing plate. So I'll just continue cutting where I can.
Okay, almost done.
Above here on top, you'll once again have to be mindful of where you're cutting, as this is the location for your parking brake piston. This is what it should look like once you're done cutting. Looking at it from the front, you'll be able to see just the parking brake and the hub. And if you look at it from behind here, you'll notice that it basically traces the parking brake near perfectly. And once you're finished cutting, what you do next is to grab your rotor. This is the 370Z 13.8-inch rotor. What you want to do is to take your lug nut and tighten it against the rotor. If your lug nut does not reach the rotor, just take a few washers or a spacer of some sort and lay it on before your lug nut. Once you have done that, you'll want to now just spin it. And as you spin, just listen carefully to any type of scraping noises. If you hear anything, grind down those trouble spots. If possible, try to look at the rotor from behind. And as you spin from behind, you should be able to hopefully see if any of the cuts you made are hitting the edge of the rotor here. And once you have done that, it should be making no more scraping noises, which by then you'll be able to move on to the next step. Now, in your kit, you will have 4 M10 bolts and 4 M12 bolts. Your brackets should both come labeled and engraved with the logo. Mine are not, as they are the very first ones to be made. Before we can start everything, to install the 2 piston calipers on your vehicle, you will need to attach the bracket to the caliper first. Here I have the 350Z Brembo. And to do that, grab the appropriate caliper and mount the bracket with the logo facing outward, such as this. Now you will take 2 M12 bolts and hand thread it into the caliper. Once again, the logo should be facing outwards. An easier way to also do this is that the left bracket is paired with the right 350Z caliper. The bleeder valve should be pointing upwards. Now grab a 10mm hex socket and begin tightening down your M12 bolts. I did not do it here, but you should torque down these bolts to about 53 to 71 foot-pounds. Once you have torqued those down, we can move on to the car. To begin, slip your rotor over the hub assembly and get a feel for your parking brake. Adjust your parking brake as necessary and to your liking. Here you'll see me play with the parking brake's fitment for a little bit. By the way, don't mind the missing stud. I was about to create a DIY video on that, but I had lost my replacement stud. Grab your bracket and caliper. It should be lined up such as this. Remember that the logo is facing outwards or the unicorn is facing upwards. The brackets are zinc coated, but I'm going to be applying anti-seize to them anyways. It will be a good peace of mind. Grab your 2 M10 bolts Place your caliper with the bracket over the rotor. Hand tighten the M10 bolts onto the spindle. If your kit came with block and flat washers, then use either one or both of these, as the bolts are roughly 3 to 5 millimeters too long. Once they have been seated, begin tightening the bolts with the wrench. And once fully tightened, torque down the two M10 bolts to 79 foot-pounds. Clearly, I'm not doing that here, but I'm pretty used to tightening components by feel. Here you see me removing the two cotter pins and the two guide pins that were left in my caliper. Apply your backing plate if they came separate from your brake pads. Mine, as you see here, are adhesive, so just give it a nice press. And there you go. Now do the same for the other pad. Once you have that done, apply some high-temp silicone brake lubricant. Apply to the backside and the side where it will make contact with the caliper. As you see, I like to lube inside of the caliper as well. Just be careful not to get any on your rotor. Next, slide in both of your brake pads. Grab your spring clip and your guide pins. As you see, I do like to lubricate mine. Begin by inserting one guide pin. Next, place the clip underneath and insert the remaining guide pin while pushing down the bottom of the clip. Cotter pins, they go in to secure the guide pins. Keep in mind that the pins should be aligned upwards to allow the cotter pin to slip on nicely. If not, you can use a small poking tool to poke and realign the hole. If you messed up, then you will have to remove the pin just like I did here and repeat the previous steps. Wipe down your caliper, rotor, and work area. Next, it's time to bust open that banjo bolt on your old caliper. But before doing this, make sure to apply some line blockers to squeeze the brake line to minimize any brake fluid drip. Or you can replace the entirety of the brake line for some aftermarket stainless steel brake lines. Once you get the banjo bolt loose, ensure that there are no copper crush washers still stuck to the line. As you can see, that's exactly what happened to me here, and I spent a little bit of time trying to remove them. Grab your new, shorter banjo bolt with one copper crush washer already applied. Slip it through the line. Now place the second copper crush washer on the bottom end. It should look like a sandwich of some sort. Align the banjo bolt to the caliper and hand tighten. Once that is done, proceed to torque the banjo bolt to 25 foot-pounds. When that is completed, make sure to clean your area and inspect your parts for torque. Make sure nothing is left loose and hanging. The original line should be able to bolt on from its original location on the rear side, or you can just zip tie it in place. When using an aftermarket line, you should be able to move that bracket by sliding it back and forth. After all of that is completed, it is time to bleed your brakes. Acura recommends from front left, front right, left rear, and then right rear. Traditionally, we bleed from the furthest from right rear, left rear, front, and finally front left. With Brembos, make sure to bleed from the outside bleeder valve first and then the inside. And you're all set.